Before I begin today's episode, I want to speak honestly and openly from the heart. In this session, I'll be speaking frankly about death, grief, and the moments that can change a life forever. If that feels too raw right now, please take care of your heart and come back when you're ready. So, they say that there is the life before and the life after. When my husband, an Aquarius sun, died suddenly in February 2011, my world split into two. The love we shared still spans dimensions. I sense him, I hear him in songs, I meet him in my dreams. But that loss, the unforgiving grief, is what drew me into this work, the work of mediumship, astrology, and soul therapy. So today, with this post, I want to do two things with absolute clarity. One is read the astrology of the day in 2011 as it related to my chart. And two is read today's astrology right now and just give you an understanding of why this is coming up for me now, and also why it's reanimating those themes from that really unforgiving day. So, just to be clear, this is not my husband's death chart. It is simply the reflection of my chart on that day in 2011 and the echo that I'm experiencing in the sky today. I really hope that this helps you if you are also experiencing grief at the moment or have had a recent loss. I always use astrology to give me understanding, to give me a sense of groundedness, to help me to really develop hope that some things are temporary and they too shall pass, but also to know that I'm always being guided and protected, and that we are mere humans here, and we are literally here for a moment in time. We are nothing more than a speck on the surface of the planet. So, before I get into the astrology, I just want to speak a little bit about the historic symbolism of the planet Jupiter and the 10th house. So, in traditional astrology, especially in less recent times, a woman's marital status was considered part of her public identity. So, the 10th house that we speak to today as being about career and reputation, it actually reflected status. And for women, that status was often tied to the father, as in you are the daughter of the doctor, the lawyer, the candlestick maker. And that was before marriage. And once married, your status would be referred to according to your husband. So, husband of the butcher, the baker, etc. Now, Jupiter in a woman's chart has long been linked to the archetype of the husband. So, this symbolism comes from its association with benefic energy, protection, and expansion, the qualities that a traditional culture would have expected from a husband's role. In my case, on the day that my husband transitioned, Jupiter was not only active in my chart, but it was making precise aspects to points tied to my identity and life direction. So it was a clear symbolic mirror. The husband figure, Jupiter, making a decisive, life altering impact on my status and path. 10th house themes. So, the day that everything changed. So, looking at transits to my natal chart on that February day in 2011, I can give you some of the aspects. I will make it, as plain as possible so that you can interpret and follow along. The reason that I'm doing this is because, as mentioned in the post, I do feel called by the current energy to start the process of sharing my own story of grief and how I stepped into my real purpose and began the work that I now do full time. I also feel very, very strongly that in embarking on such a heartfelt and meaningful journey, which is what Beyond the Veil is all about. This is the essence of my Substack, my primary Substack newsletter, is that I do speak about the connection with spirit, with being in communication with our loved ones who have transitioned, as well as connecting with the skies through astrology and cosmic guidance, and also doing soul therapy work, which is really about understanding how our souls evolve in each incarnation or lifetime. And part of that does include, as well as life and coming into the world, it also includes death and the way that we transition. Now, a big part of looking at the idea of death and communicating and connecting beyond the veil does require that we explore and examine grief. And I know that for many of you here on my Substack, if you are existing clients that I've met over the past 8 or 9 years, then we probably did meet as a result of grief. The thing that started this for me was actually working with people who had lost loved ones for whatever reason in really tragic circumstances, usually, and connecting them to receive those messages of love, forgiveness, and hope. So it is really quite, I guess, auspicious that the energy at the moment is speaking to me in such a way that I am being called to step forward with my own story in a very public way on this platform. I've never done this before. I would have spoken to individual clients, but not everybody knows my story. And I don't know that I was ready before to really share in the way that I'm ready to share now. But as with all things, divine timing is necessary. So I'm going to give you an account of my birth chart on that fateful day back in February 2011, and then I'll take you through the astrology of today. Now, for some of you, you might not find this interesting, and I completely understand. Please go ahead, read the post, and take from that what you will. But for those of you who are developing your knowledge of astrology, who, like me many years ago, became fascinated with understanding what is really going on. I mean, when you get into those times of life where it feels like an emotional pileup, it does bring you to your knees and you do ask, what is going on? Why is this happening to my life? And for me, astrology became the tool and the practice that I learned to help me make sense and give me a deeper understanding of what's really going on in life. So you may get something out of this. I really hope you do. And yeah, I'll just take you through the chart from that day, and then I'll give you some perspective on what's happening now. So looking at the transits to my natal placements on that February day in 2011, I may give some exact aspects, and in other cases, I'll just give you an interpretation. So we can start with, and this is in no particular order, but Mars, the planet that represents men or the masculine, was in a sextile to Chiron, and it was in a really, really small orbit. It was at 0 degrees. And Chiron is what we call the wounded healer. And Chiron often speaks to the wounds and the traumas that we experience in life and the ways in which we're called to experience healing and recovery in this lifetime. So, with Mars being the planet that represents the masculine in a sextile, which is in this case a very close aspect, it really spoke to the opportunity born of pain, where healing, in connection to men or the masculine, in my case, the husband, um, this was the initiation into that. So this transit described the shock or the sudden change that would take place in my life, but it also spoke to the future opportunity, like me having the courage eventually to speak, teach, and act from this particular wound. Saturn, the planet that we are all familiar with as being the cold and distant, the karmic redeemer, the teacher, the disciplinarian in life, was in a conjunction with my natal Uranus. And I've spoken about Uranus recently, where Uranus is the planet of sudden, unexpected change and shocks. And this conjunction was at 17 degrees in the sign of Libra. Libra rules marriage and partnership. So this Saturn conjunct Uranus, they were both at 17 degrees. So again, a very, very tight orb, represented security versus freedom. Now, just an aside, Saturn typically represents the 10th house in the chart, and the stellium in the sky was in my 10th house. Even though it was in the sign of Aquarius, Saturn also rules Aquarius as well as Capricorn. So this would speak to the planet Saturn was dispensing the energy of all of those planets up in my 10th house in Aquarius, and how that energy was affecting the energy of Uranus in Libra at the time that I was born. So I hope that makes sense. So this was about the past versus the future, but it wasn't about me having a choice. It was about the manifestation of a structural break, a sudden event, something that would require rebuilding in the future. And in this case, it would have been the breaking of my marriage and the need to one day in the future rebuild my core or key partnership. I also had in the sky, Neptune was trine the asteroid Juno, and Juno is the asteroid of commitment. Again, this was a really tight orb at 0 degrees, and Juno does represent commitment and marriage. Juno was the wife of Zeus, and Neptune dissolves things. Neptune is really about dreams and illusions and the ethereal. And so it was as if the marriage bond was being dissolved as part of a soul contract. So it would have felt very deeply spiritual. And trines, even though they are very harmonious aspects, that simply means that it would have opened up maybe a softer path for, I don't know, forgiveness and continuing bonds and love beyond the physical. And the reason I say that it would have represented a softer path is because myself and my daughters, we weren't in the vehicle with him. We could have been, and that would have been even more traumatic and disturbing. We didn't witness the accident. So, as terrible and disconcerting as it was, there was still elements of grace in the actual event. So, the sun at that time was in the sign of Aquarius, and it was sextiling Chiron, the wounded healer, the asteroid that represents the wounds, the trauma, and the healing. And the sun sextiling Chiron, again at a 0 degree orb, it represented an opening into a healing path. So even amid crisis, this speaks to the emergence of purpose. It speaks to what would become the eventual shift into therapy, mediumship, and teaching. The moon was in aspect to the planet Venus. Venus is the ruler of Libra, so the ruler of love and marriages. And the moon represents our emotions. The moon often shows up as being in key aspect when somebody transitions, And so this would have spoken to the emotional needs, the unsettled and dislocated feeling of the early onset of grief. And the North Node was square Pluto. At that point, Pluto is making a transit through Capricorn, which would have made it in square to my natal Pluto, which just made that time of my life pretty difficult anyway. So work was difficult, parenting was challenging. There were a lot of difficulties going on. And obviously, with the North Node square Pluto, it became a non-negotiable destiny. So the nodal path demands a plutonian metamorphosis, so to speak, which meant that you can never go back to before. The only way out is through. Chiron was sextiling Jupiter. So, Jupiter being the husband, Chiron representing the womb. It was the pain became an aperture into expansion, wisdom, and faith. Because while Jupiter represents the husband, it also represents our faith, our belief systems, and in some cases, wisdom and understanding. And eventually, this wound would become a teaching practice for me. And then Venus was square Pluto. So it really was putting the marriage and the love under undeniable pressure. And Pluto, as the planet of transformation, death, and rebirth, would have really brought about the energy of irrevocable transformation. Mercury was in the sign of Aquarius at 2 degrees, in aspect to Pluto. So there would have been a really deep, penetrating action or activity, because Mercury does rule things like travel, communication, like movement. And in time, that accident, which rendered me almost speechless at the time, I remember losing my voice at that time. In time, it gave me the capacity to speak about grief. And that's speaking to where we are today, because we are in a time of Mercury aspecting Pluto once again, but I'll get into that in a second. So there were lots of aspects involving Saturn. Saturn was in aspect to the moon. It was in aspect to Neptune, Jupiter and Pluto, Jupiter and Chiron. Jupiter was also aspecting my ascendant, and the ascendant is how you show up in life. And it just completely changed my status in the world. I went from being a wife to a widow. And it also meant that I was being initiated into this life of very deep, connected spirituality and soul work. Up until this point, my faith had been almost like secondary. I did have a faith practice, but it wasn't forefront in my life. And I was very, very consumed with some of the more material aspects of planets like Jupiter and Venus, where everything had been about making lots of money, providing a great life for our children and our family, going on luxurious holidays and that kind of thing. And this event had completely changed my priorities and put my faith and belief system at the forefront. So yeah, there were a ton of aspects on that day. Obviously, with there being a stellium in Aquarius, where there were so many planets in the sign of Aquarius on that day. I mean, there was Mercury at 2 degrees. There was Mars at 16 degrees, the Sun at 16 degrees, Neptune at 27, and Chiron at 29 degrees. The day before, the moon had been in Aquarius at 28 degrees. So it was a ton of activity. The planet Uranus, which is one of the co-rulers of Aquarius, along with Saturn, Uranus was in Pisces, and Pisces rules the 12th house, which is the house of spirituality, hidden forces, and essentially death or being beyond the veil. So that day in 2011, in retrospect, looking back with the knowledge that I've accrued over the years, with the understanding that I've developed and I'm still developing, um, it spoke to a really traumatic time. It spoke to a really deep level of transformation for both myself, my husband, and my children, because a lot of this was obviously aspecting my fourth house in Leo, because Aquarius was opposing Leo. And while there weren't any transiting planets in Leo, I do have placements there, one of which being the planet Venus, which does rule marriage. So that's what was happening at the time. So if we look at this as a whole, that time in 2011 essentially reads like a Plutonian initiation. And if you know anything about Pluto, or if you have any understanding, a Plutonian initiation is the journey of Persephone, it's Inanna's descent. It's essentially the journey that at some point in our lives, many of us will take, which is the journey into the underworld, where sorry, it's the journey into the underworld where we do become transformed. So in mythology, Greek, Roman, Celtic mythology, um, the Plutonian initiation is the idea that we visit the gates of hell, we go into Hades, the underworld, where we lose all of our innocence. So the things that perhaps created a naivete in life, or the idea that everything would be idealistic and you just live this great life, getting married really young, having a family young. I definitely was, set up for this Nirvana style life and had the really strong belief that I was doing everything right. Therefore, life would treat me right. And this is not about things being right or wrong. It's about the reality that taking that Plutonian journey, like visiting the underworld in such a palpable way, is actually really key to my growth. It has helped me to become the person that I am today, and also um, helped me to face the greatest fear that we face as human beings, which is the fear of death. And for those of you that have been there and that feel me on this particular point, when you lose a partner or a child, and it is a little bit different than losing a parent, not saying that you wouldn't have a close relationship with a parent, but some deaths, especially when you're of a certain age, like being in your 30s and losing your husband, is not necessarily the most natural thing that we expect. Um, it does completely change your identity. And so facing that fear, up until that point, my whole life was about doing everything possible to avoid that one thing, whether I was aware of it or not. And so facing that and still being here just really took me on a journey, the Plutonian initiation, that opened up a life path of healing and teaching and really transformed my identity, my public status, and my relationship with astrology, spirituality, and soul work. So today is the 14th of August. And this is obviously not just about today. This has been building through this Mercury retrograde and some of the other retrogrades. The echo brings me back to that time in February 2011. So in today's sky, here's what's active. Mercury has literally ended its retrograde in Leo 3 days ago. and is now moving direct at 4 degrees. And it's opposing Pluto, which is currently retrograde at 2 degrees of Aquarius. So, again, in my chart, this is activating the fourth and 10th house axis. It's just that now we've got Pluto in Aquarius in the 10th house and Mercury in Leo in the fourth house. So they're still having a really powerful conversation about home and family, my public status, my reputation. And Mercury this time is giving me a voice. It's allowing me to share my message, to speak on this particular narrative as it faces Pluto, which is about the depth, the truth, and the power as it retrogrades in the sign of Aquarius. So it's like I can finally speak without crying, without collapsing, without having some form of emotional breakdown, speak really honestly and truthfully about the experience of grief and loss. And yes, it's 14 years later, but I promise you this, you never get over it. You just learn a new way of life. But being able to put words to some of that emotion and some of that life experience, it puts me in a place where perhaps there is an opportunity to have somebody relate to my experience. Somebody might be preparing to go through this and feel hopeless in the way that I did, or somebody might have just gone through this in the past year or couple of years and be discovering many of the things that I discovered. So public teaching of a private story is really about being of service to the wider collective. I know that life is really difficult at the moment for many of us in lots of different ways, whether it's on a world view or even as individuals, but being able to share experiences we know really helps us to make sense of things that are happening in our lives. And Saturn, which is by all means a really key planet when it comes to death and grief and how we deal with life. It's now retrograde in the sign of Aries at 1 degree and is opposing my natal Pluto in Libra, the sign of marriage, at 1 degree. So again, while this is happening, it's an exact, almost like test or invitation around how I carry power, grief, and responsibility. So Saturn is asking me, what structures do I have to rebuild in my life so that I might get to that place? And we don't know. I mean, what's to be will be, but I might get to that place of rebuilding marriage and partnership in my life again. So Saturn's asking me, what structures must I develop? Where do I require discipline, ethics, boundaries? But also, where must I soften? Where am I still controlling and hyper vigilant as a result of losing my husband in 2011? So in Libra, this reevaluates partnership imprints and how I hold relational power after loss. And this is such a huge teaching moment for so many of us that have lost partners and are still out in the world, living life as best we can, but open to forming new relationships. And I just want to state that loss is not always about death. It can be divorce, it can be separation. It can just be that somebody moves on and you're dealing with really intense traumatic heartbreak. So the reason this feels so alive for me at the moment, and I feel as if I'm being initiated into this series on grief, is that today's transits simply resonant with 2011 and 11's themes, with the Saturn Pluto, the Mercury Pluto, the 10th and 4th house axis activation. So it's as if the universe is reopening the file on the case, not to re-traumatize, but to integrate a higher octave and bring a level of closure, setting new foundations and a new cornerstone. that I can move forward and build on. So just to reflect, Jupiter shows up as the husband, Saturn is associated with karmic debt and redemption. Mercury represents Hermes, the divine messenger, the one that dances between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. And of course, Pluto, the great transformer. Um, so I just want to say that, sometimes I have to remind myself of these things. So I'm saying it to you while reminding myself that grief isn't tidy. It's in fact tidal. Um, and sometimes you do feel as though you're drowning or being washed away. And tomorrow I'll be sharing a guest post from a dear friend and amazing woman, Dr. Vinay Williams, who is a licensed physical therapist, and she'll be speaking about the way grief is stored and held in the body and what we can do to release that. So we'll be talking a little bit about somatic practices. But there are aspects of grief that can be really, really difficult to identify and to make peace with. And what I tend to do with challenges like this is I like to give them language or meaning through words. And it took me a long time to come to terms with the phrase widow or widowhood. But in doing my research, I found that widowhood comes from the Sanskrit root meaning empty. And it's the best description possible. If you're a parent who has outlived a child, the word is vilama, which also comes from Sanskrit and means to go against the natural order. And in terms of other types of loss and grief, there's anticipatory grief, which is grieving in anticipation of the worst case scenario happening, disenfranchised grief, complicated grief, and collective grief for the times when we go through major traumatic events that affect us as a community or country. So for me, making sense of my experience has led me on this path where I initially became a therapist for my children. I wanted to help them make sense of what happened. And I was really, really keen to understand for myself what was happening to us. But also, I didn't want them to be inhibited by our loss in their future life. I also did my best to quiet my psychic abilities. I've had these as long as I've known myself, and they became really clear to me around the age of 2. But they wouldn't quiet. In fact, they became stronger. And I would often find myself in positions where I was forced to share messages with people from beyond the veil. So I just learned that death is the great awakener. Grief was a really powerful teacher for me. And the most important thing is that everything stopped when my husband died. My career stopped. We stopped living where we lived. My family dynamics changed in terms of external family, even with friends. And I just learned that there was purpose in grief. And it has led me to this platform, the work that I do now. And I'm super, super intentional about doing everything I can to strengthen my psychic mediumship, my astrology, my soul work, so that I can share hope, forgiveness, and love with those that are either ahead of me in this journey or those coming up behind me. Because there are only 2 guarantees in life, and one is coming into the world and one is transitioning out. So if you're going through a really tough time, if you are in the midst of grief, I really want to hear from you. Please comment, send me a direct message. If you're struggling and you would like to connect with a loved one who's passed, please message me. I am very open to offering free consultations to a small number of people. I cannot do this for everyone. I'm sure you understand. But part of my practice, my mission and my purpose is to bring relief to those that I can in whatever way possible. So if it's a difficult time for you and money is an issue, please get in touch. And I'll be really, really thrilled to offer you that consultation. The other thing I would say is if you are interested in finding out maybe what was happening around the time of your own grief or loss, then you can book a cosmic guidance session or a birth chart consultation. The links will be at the bottom of the post. And that's only if you want to have some understanding and just get a bit of clarity around what was going on. For me, it really helps to know that, first of all, I wasn't the cause of this, even though I was nowhere near the accident. In some way, as human beings, we always find a way to blame ourselves and take responsibility where we shouldn't. But also, it gives me so much hope and faith in knowing that things do happen in life, but we can figure out a way to move on and live with whatever it is that we're facing. So I hope you find this really useful. This is the first post in a series. I will be introducing more posts on grief with Beyond the Veil. That was the initial purpose of starting this, not just to speak about astrology and spirituality, but to really shine a light on transfiguration, which is the transformation from the physical into the light body. And also just to help us to get really clear on how we can stay connected with our loved ones when they pass, how to recognize the signs, whether it's the songs they play when we're not paying attention, the butterflies, which I had a beautiful experience with recently, the dragonflies, the ladybugs, whatever it is, the banging, the dog barking, all the ways in which our loved ones let us know that they're around, especially in those quiet moments when we're missing them the most. So please stay tuned if this is the kind of content that speaks to your soul and you find it helpful at all. So thank you so much for listening. As I mentioned earlier, tomorrow I'll be sharing an amazing guest post from Dr. Vinay Williams, and we will be having a Substack live conversation on Sunday, the 17th of August. You are all invited. Please share this post with anybody that you think it can help or that may relate to it. And I look forward to seeing you all on Sunday for the Substack live. Thank you so much for listening. And with love, power, and devotion, keep doing the best that you can every day that you can. Take care.